Hey, economics students, welcome back to Distance Learning Wednesday. It's very exciting. Today we're going to continue our lessons over market failures. Yesterday was sort of a general overview talking about the four main reasons that markets can fail. What we talked about yesterday was pretty much review the idea that when we have imperfectly competitive markets, they will not allocate resources efficiently. And that's essentially what a market failure is. It's any time when a market does not optimize or produce, or I should say distribute resources efficiently. And today we're going to be going into another big one that's happening right now, which is called externalities, market failures due to externalities, market externalities. Tomorrow we'll talk about markets not being able to produce public goods, and then Friday we'll wrap it up with information asymmetry, which is fun to say. So I did share with you today an Edpuzzle video, which sort of supplements the lesson that I'm doing right now online. It goes into externalities. It has a couple questions. One or two of them are kind of tricky, but it's not really meant to be tricky. It's meant to sort of supplement and give you it's not a different take, but it's presented in a different way about market failures. Externalities in particular. So yes, yesterday, if you remember, we talked about, I showed you a picture of a grocery store without any milk in it. And then I showed you videos of farmers literally dumping tons, gallons of milk and sort of saying this is a market failure. You have people who want resources that can't get resources. You have farmers who want to sell resources that can't get their resources to market. That's not the way resource allocation is supposed to work. But you're probably saying, Mr. Court, you left out a pretty big piece of the puzzle yesterday. How can you call that a market failure when the true problem is that the government is sort of stepping in and telling people they're not allowed to go grocery shopping, that they're not allowed to go to restaurants, that schools are not allowed to have children in them? This isn't a market failure. This is the government coming in and really messing up the markets. And that's a pretty valid point. There is a little bit of market failure, but a lot of the market failures are happening because of government intervention. So today we are going to hit the type of market failure that usually requires some sort of government intervention. And we call that market failure a negative externalities. It can be negative or positive. So here is what an externality is. So, in general, here is what a negative, or what I should say, what an externality is. There are two types, positive and negative. All right, so an externality, a very simple way to think of an externality is an unintended side effect of producing or consuming some sort of a product. All right, it's an unintended side effect. So we'll give some examples here in a second. A negative externality is when there is an additional cost imposed on people when there is a product that is being produced or consumed. A cost that is not being paid either by the producer or the consumer. So it's an unintended side effect. It's an unintended cost that is being thrown out into society. It can be a monetary cost. It could be a cost of people's utility, a cost of time, it could be all sorts of different types of costs. Very good examples. The classic example of a negative externality is pollution. All right, so again, when there is a factory, we'll say a steel factory, or let's go with a coal power plant, a power plant that is using coal to make electricity. All right, that power plant, its main goal is to take coal and turn it into electricity so that people will buy electricity. All right. The issue is in that process, they have to burn a lot of coal, and that coal pollutes the environment. And that has a cost to all the people who live around that coal power plant. And the people living around the power plant have no say in production. That they aren't having any impact or having any sort of ability to explain to a factory what they can and can't produce. The factory is determining that, the power plant, in other words. And so that is a negative externality. It is an unintended side effect of the production of electricity. A positive externality is the opposite. So a positive externality is when the production or consumption of a product has a benefit to the people who did not buy it. So this is a situation where a product is providing a benefit to all sorts of people, even those who are not consuming the product. So a great example is vaccinations. So if I get a vaccination, I'm getting a vaccination because it's bringing me a benefit. It's keeping me from getting sick. That's my individual private benefit. However, it doesn't only benefit me to get a vaccination. Because I am healthy and have a vaccination, that means that I cannot be a carrier and give you the flu when I come and work at school. So you are getting a benefit, even though you did not pay for my flu vaccination, which I don't know if I got one this year, come to think of it, but regardless, even if you didn't pay for it, you're still getting a benefit. So vaccinations are what we call positive externalities. So a more sort of traditional economic way to explain externalities is the idea of what we call private costs versus external costs. A private cost is any cost that, I should say, a private cost is a cost that only the individual firm or household, in other words, only the individual producer or consumer who is either producing or consuming a product has to take into account. All right, so when I am using my electricity, the only cost that I am thinking about is the cost of the bill that I have to pay every month for it. All right, when I am pumping gas into my car to drive to work, the only cost I'm really worried about is the dollar signs are going ching 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 on the gas machine. What is that called? Gas pump. On the gas pump. That's the only cost that I am worrying about. That is my private cost. Likewise, the same is true with businesses. When businesses produce gasoline or produce electricity, the only costs they're worried about are the cost of producing the product, of buying the coal to turn into electricity, or buying the oil to refine into gas. Those are the only personal costs that they care about. Those are private costs. An external cost, then, is any cost that is incurred by others who did not participate in our economic decision making. So again, let's take the idea of me consuming electricity. All right, I am turning on my lights every day. My refrigerator is running. The only cost I really care about is the bill that I pay every month to have that electricity running. The only cost that the electric company cares about is the cost of buying the coal and the cost of buying the labor and the cost of buying all the other resources needed to produce electricity. We are not taking into the account of all of the people who are being impacted by the pollution of that coal plant that is making electricity. Those people are paying a cost. I'm not paying that cost. I'm not breathing in the dirty air. The big wigs who are in charge and have power over the coal company, they're not out there breathing the air in. They're in their corporate suites. None of us are paying those costs. Those are external costs. And then the same thing is true of what we call private benefits versus external benefits. Again, when I am buying a flu vaccine, I'm only caring, I mean, obviously I do care more. I don't want to get my wife sick, but in general, when we are buying products, we're only worrying about the benefit we get from that product. So when I go to the store, or I go to McDonald's and I decide to buy, two double pounder, quarter pound cheeseburgers, I'm only caring about my own private benefit. I'm not caring about any benefit that might give to anyone else around me, even though me buying all that, it's actually would be more of a negative externality because once I eat all that food, I come home and I feel like a glutton and I just sit on the couch and then I don't get the household chores done that I need to get done. So that would actually be of a negative externality. But regardless, when I'm choosing to consume something, I'm only concerned about my private benefit. So another way to think about private cost and private benefits that goes along with what we've already learned in regards of supply and demand. Again, when firms and households are making their economic decisions, they're only taking into account their private costs and private benefits. And so another way to think about private benefits, a demand curve represents the private benefits of consumers. Consumers are willing to consume products that give them a certain amount of utility or benefit. All right, so again, when we look at the demand curve, another way to think of our demand curve, it represents the private benefit of that product to consumers. Likewise, a supply curve represents the private costs that a firm incurs to produce a product. So when you look at a supply curve, or if we're looking at theory of the firm, it's a marginal cost curve. But when you look at a supply curve, it is showing us the private costs a firm incurs to produce something. And this works well, all right? Markets work really well. Demand and supply, like we've learned, work perfectly as long as there aren't additional costs that those two curves aren't taking into account. And that's what externalities are. They are additional costs and or additional benefits that are incurring that the curves themselves don't take into account. Because again, when I'm consuming something, I'm not taking into account how it might impact others. When businesses produce something, they're not taking into account how it might impact others. So let's look at this and see what it looks like on a graph. This demand curve represents the marginal benefit that that consumers receive when they consume something. This supply curve represents the marginal, or not the marginal, I should say the private benefit. The supply curve represents the private cost a firm incurs when it is producing products. If there is a product like electricity and the coal power plant producing electricity that actually has what we call a negative externality. It has additional costs, external costs that people have to pay. Um, it has external costs that are incurred by people who are not producing or paying for the product. What that means is that the cost for society is actually higher than what the regular supply curve is showing. All right, so this is our private cost. It doesn't take into account the cost of pollution. All right, if it does take that into account, our cost would actually be quite higher. All right, so our costs would be much higher if we took into account the cost of pollution. And what that means is that right here, this is our social cost to produce electricity in the example that I'm using. All right, and because this is our new social cost, or this is a supply curve that represents the social cost of pollution, we should be producing at this point right here. All right, but if we don't take into account the social costs of pollution, the market would have us produce right here at the original supply curve, right here at this original point. All right, so we are producing Q quantity at P price when we really should be producing a much less quantity. So when there is a negative externality, when there are extra costs, the market will produce way too much of a product than is socially optimal. And then the opposite is true. Like when it comes to the example is vaccines. When individuals choose to consume vaccines and get vaccinated, if they're just taking into account their own private benefits, we would produce right here, according to market economics, we would produce at this quantity. However, like we had just said in our previous slides, more people benefit than just us people who are getting vaccinated. There is an additional benefit to the people around us, and because of that, there should be an increased benefit. The amount of benefit should increase for our society, meaning that we should be demanding and wanting more vaccinations than what we are actually getting at the market. All right, and in that situation, if we were to take into account the increase of the benefit of vaccinations, we should really be producing a much higher quantity of vaccination. All right. And so that's pretty much externalities. I kind of flubbed through the last part there, but hopefully it makes sense. The main takeaways: negative externalities lead to negative externalities lead to overproduction, meaning that when we have negative externality, we are producing more than is socially optimal. Positive externalities means that we are not producing enough. we are not producing at our socially optimal point. And so yeah, that wraps up externalities. There is an ed puzzle that goes into this that doesn't flub it up a little bit like I did. Hopefully after you watch the ed puzzle, answer some questions, this kind of comes together pretty well. If not, we'll do some follow-ups going into next week when we review a little bit. All right, so tomorrow I'll be back with you with public goods. Go ahead, go to your ed puzzles, get those done. Ideally, I'd like those done by Friday. As always, though, if you're having issues or problems, just let me know and we'll figure out something else. All right, everyone, thank you. Bye.